The next speaker will be Scott Kominers from Harvard Business School, talking about an economic framework for vaccine prioritization. Scott, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Very honored to be here. Sorry not to be there in person, but very glad to be able to be here virtually with you. I'm going to be speaking about an economic framework for vaccine prioritization. This is joint work with Mohammad Akbarpour, Eric Budish, and Piotr Dworczak, all three of whom are totally extraordinary. And so, I'm giving the talk, but you should attribute massive fractions of the credit for all of the thinking here to them. So I should start by saying this is a very auspicious day to be talking about vaccine prioritization because just yesterday, finally, the fourth vaccine was approved in the United States. Fourth COVID-19 vaccine was approved in the United States, Novavax. This is a quick reminder: if you're booster eligible, please get boosted. But very excitingly, this is a different vaccine technology, and it's one where there are some reasons to think, and some of the early trial results suggest there may be sort of more like broad spectrum coverage against the varying and highly mutating Omicron strains. And those of you who've seen me speak at EC will know that I frequently bring auspicious days up. It just happens that that the days we talk are auspicious. But this one is really very exciting, although it's also, I guess, a little bit hard that it's still possible to find new important vaccine news virtually every day. In any event, so this paper has as its backdrop a classic question, which is whether we should allocate via prices or priorities. This is sometimes called colloquially by philosophers, the question of which goods should not be for sale. And as market designers, we're amenable to the idea that maybe in principle some goods shouldn't be, but there's still this question of which and why and how. So this played out in vaccine allocation worldwide over the last year and a half, 2 years. Most countries, including the United States, used a at least partially priority-based allocation system for vaccines. The US, the allocation system was essentially exclusively priority-based. There was earlier access to medical workers and frontline workers, as well as higher risk individuals, and then they sort of moved down a curve to broader access. And what we're going to do today is we're going to examine these types of policies using mechanism design. And what we're going to find is that contrary to the sort of standard economic intuition that you just want to use prices to allocate stuff, a priority system with rationing actually can outperform price-based rules. But we're also going to show that in general, the optimal mechanism is a hybrid of both. It uses some mixture of prioritization and pricing, and I'll show you precisely what that means. Footnote, just to sort of close the loop on what's going on here, the reason you might find yourself wanting to use priority-based or partially priority-based allocation is that willingness to pay might not align with the designer's objective. And there are sort of two broad reasons why this can happen. We'll see both of them. One of them is if you have redistributive concerns. And the other is if you have externalities. So redistributive concerns, you're concerned about inequality, right? So the people who might have the highest ability to pay might also be the ones who are much safer staying, and able to stay at home, and work, sort of remotely. Whereas the people who, have lower income jobs, those jobs have to be in person, but they also might have less ability to pay. And externalities might be that people who are, very healthy might be making decisions that actually come with very high transmission risks. But they themselves don't internalize, sort of that concern because they themselves are healthy. And so, there's an externality. You might want them to be vaccinated as well. Conceptual conclusions, again, just to sort of set up for your thinking, the takeaways, the priorities versus prices dichotomy that we see over and over again is totally artificial. What we'll see is that priorities are useful when we have observables that tell us stuff about, relevant to our welfare goals. And prices are useful when they screen for unobserved heterogeneity that's relevant to those goals. And in particular, we're going to argue in novel, there's no such thing really as a novel role for prices, but at least within the frame of these mechanisms, screening is actually going to help us implement the welfare goals rather than just sort of get things to the people who sort of themselves have the highest willingness to pay. And that's sort of different from the way we normally think of the role of prices in markets. Okay, There's a massive related literature and stacks and stacks of recent research, including some really super important papers by Manuel and co-authors, Prasad and co-authors, and Pathak and co-authors, trying to understand what the different frameworks and sort of inputs to a question of how you allocate vaccines, should, in the context of a pandemic should be. And then also, how do you actually do the implementation? What is a good mechanism for doing that allocation? A lot of what we're saying here actually echoes sort of much more classical work on vaccine targeting. And then it plays in also with these sort of growing areas of inequality-aware mechanism design and mechanism design with allocative externalities. We're in particular going to be building on a previous paper that Mohammad and Piotr and I wrote, which builds very heavily on a paper of Condarelli, which, and all of this sort of is an echo of an idea of Weitzman. Okay, so here is the model. We are going to be allocating vaccines that become available over time, and agents are going to take privately observed action. So you're going to, either take precautions or not. And what it means to, take precautions is going to vary from person to person. It's reducing in-person activity. So if you're an academic, that might be, sort of teaching over Zoom. If you're a doctor, it might mean that you only see patients half the days of the week instead of, all the days of the week. But so there's a safe action and a risky action. And your decision is going to depend on the benefit in terms of your health of taking the safe action, and the disutility, sort of like a socioeconomic cost of taking precautions. So that might be inefficient because there might also be externality. So the health externality is going to be the externality you cause if you take the risky action. So if you go out and don't do, don't sort of, stay as in, sort of avoid as much in-person activity as you can, then there's some health externality. You might become infected and thus might infect others. But if you stay in, there's a socioeconomic externality. Maybe teaching over Zoom, you don't get to engage with your students as much as if you're teaching in person. If you're seeing patients only half the week, or in person only half the week and the other half over telehealth, maybe those, those consultants, patient doctor consultants don't go as well. Consultations, sorry, don't go as well. One more sort of key input, there's going to be an unobserved social welfare rate. So this is something that tells us sort of given what we sort of know about the individual, how much we care about, given the individual, how much we care about weighting them. This might be lots of things. This could be inequality, like I mentioned. It could be that they're a doctor, and so we think that they're sort of positive, they have positive social value. And we're going to see a label which is informative about some of these things. So we see some observable information. So we know if you're a doctor, your safe action might, sort of not be as safe as if you're a professor. But we're also going to elicit, in a mechanism design sense, the willingness to pay for a vaccine. Footnote, it turns out to be an important simplifying assumption to assume that the externalities are independent of H&V conditional on the label. So they're sort of like the externalities mapped to the label. We probably won't get into why this is important today, but it's a simplifying assumption that that makes all of the analysis a little cleaner. But so the key is you see this label, you elicit R, and you're going to have to draw inferences about the welfare weight, because the agent, the welfare weight affects the social welfare function, but not the agent's payoff. And so as a result, the agent is not going to we're not going to be able to elicit that. We're going to have to sort of draw an inference. So how are the label and willingness to pay going to be informative about all of these different terms? Well, if you're a frontline health worker, we can sort of, just from your label, read off that you have a high health, cost of not taking precautions because you're frequently exposed. You're a frontline health worker. You also have a high socioeconomic value because you're treating patients, and these externalities are high too, right? Like you're interacting with high risk people, and you're giving patient care, and you're also taking risks to save others. So just from the label, if you're a frontline health worker, we know that all of these terms are high. And you can already guess that that's going to sort of push towards prioritization, right? Sort of frontline health workers, have high social value, high private value, and high social welfare weight. Sort of like every piece of this, high externality, high private value, high welfare weight, every piece of this suggests that there's a lot of social value to vaccinating them. Sometimes your willingness to pay is going to reveal something about your action. So if you're a healthy college student, you might be engaging in activity that carries high health externalities and some degree of sort of social, sort of private value for social activity. But it depends on your value for social activity. So if you really like hanging out with other people, you're lower health risk. We said you're a healthy college student. And so it's very likely that you're actually going to choose the risky action. You're not going to reduce your in-person activity as much as you might otherwise. And that also then means that you might have a pretty high health externality. But if you don't like interacting with other people, then on the margin, there's still a health risk. So if V is like 0, then you're going to stay home. And so this information we can't just observe off of I. We actually have to learn from your willingness to pay. And so the willingness to pay is going to be informative about the relative value of V for healthy college students. And it's also therefore going to tell us something about the externality, because it tells us whether they likely are or are not taking the risky action. We have one more example here, which I'm going to sort of breeze through just in the interest of time. But in the context of a rideshare driver, you actually could sort of be on either side, right? So they're frequently exposed if they take the risky action, but also taking the risky action is important for getting income. So there's sort of this trade-off between H and V. Might have high lambda because they're lower socioeconomic status. The willingness to pay for the vaccine doesn't necessarily tell us which action they're taking, but does tell us about the baseline level of all of these values, which again is going to be useful for figuring out their contribution to social welfare if we vaccinate them, when we vaccinate them. Okay, so payoff structure, if we vaccinate an age, I promise you, I know we're like 5 minutes till the end and I'm just describing the payoffs, but everything's going to fall very quickly from here. So if we vaccinate an agent at time t, you get benefits of vaccination for fraction delta of the pandemic. What does that mean? You just get V plus H from delta of t on, and pre, delta of t, you were getting whatever is higher of V and H, whichever action you were actually choosing. So your willingness to pay for vaccine immediately, R, is actually just equal to the minimum of V and H, right? If you plug in here, delta of t equals 0, you get the vaccine at at this moment. V plus H minus max is equal to the min, and so that's actually your willingness to pay is really very precisely identifying one of these two parameters. And meanwhile, the designer's payoff from vaccinating an agent at a given time is going to be this sort of mixture here that depends on which action the agent was taking, right? So if the agent's taking the safe action weighted by lambda, what do we get? We get the value of now being able to take the risky action, so V and VEX. Whereas if they were taking the risky action, now we get the health value, the sort of H and HX. Also, just as a footnote, we have a weight on revenue, although in many of these contexts, there was no actual shadow value on revenue in practice. So depending on which action the individual is taking, you unleash either of these two externality and value terms. And so you can go from there into a per unit welfare benefit function, which we call V, that sort of mixes together the private utility. This is sort of your expected welfare weight given your willingness to pay, a revenue term, potentially, there's that weight on revenue, and then this externality, depending on which action you're actually taking. So the optimal mechanism is going to sort of balance, within group, it's going to balance, between prioritized allocation, which generates the average welfare benefit, so the average of this V function, because we're going to be giving them out sort of randomly to everyone in the group, or using some price or Q or something is going to sort unwillingness to pay, so we get this sort of integral of this V term. Footnote also, the optimal allocation across the groups is going to be greedy with respect to this V term, conditional on the within group allocation. So once we solve this like prioritized versus pricing trade-off within the group, we actually can sort of just we know for every moment in time, if we give the next marginal vaccine unit to some group, we know precisely who's going to get it in that group, which means we know what its contribution to social welfare is. So the first big market design implication is that if prices cannot be used, so we turn off the pricing mechanism, then there's nothing better to do than vaccinating the groups sequentially in order of decreasing average social welfare per group, this expectation term. And so you get a scheme that looks very similar to what we had in the United States, where there's sort of a group, a group, a group. And these are sorted, sort of like the first one is the ones where all those terms are high, right? Every contribution to social welfare is high. That's like your doctors or potentially your very high risk individuals. Then your sort of frontline but lower risk individuals, and then eventually the general population. But now, so remember this option here that pricing or queuing is going to sort on willingness to pay. So the question is, when do we want to do that, right? So when's that better than getting the average? Well, that's precisely when this VI term is increasing. When if we sort on willingness to pay, we actually get to like put people in the order we would prefer from a welfare perspective. So within a group, we're going to want to use this like market-based allocation when this like contribution to welfare function is increasing, and free, random prioritized allocation when that's decreasing. It turns out that putting that together with the sort of like insight from before basically tells you the shape of the optimal mechanism completely. So once you allow pricing, you end up with a mixture of prioritization and pricing. It's a hybrid mechanism, where if you have some group that just has really high average welfare term, you just prioritize them, right? Like this is a case where the average, these are your doctors, that average V term is higher than the maximum V in group 3 over here. But then maybe there's some people in group 3 with really, really high willingness to pay that reveals a really high welfare term because it's increasing in willingness to pay. So then maybe you then fill some people in group 3 until the marginal value of vaccinating the next person in group 3 equals here the marginal value, the average value rather of vaccinating in group 2. Group 2 is one where again you're going in random allocation. So you just do the entirety of group 2 and then pick up group 3 and continue. And so here we see prioritization as a way of making sure that you get vaccines quickly to the people for whom that's just a high welfare priority, either because of the lambdas or because of the externalities, or just because they have really high personal value for being vaccinated. Again, often this group 1 category is like all of the above. And then prices help us screen where it's possible that some people with higher willingness to pay that might reveal things about either their level of need, maybe it's about their income if they're an Uber driver, or about their contribution to social welfare, like an externality in the case of a college student. Okay, well, that was very quick, but that's the shape of the mechanism. And again, the real sort of takeaway is that this prices priorities dichotomy is an oversimplification. What you really could use is a hybrid of both. QED.
There's a question in the room, yeah. Do we have a micro that we can carry down in the back?
I unfortunately cannot hear the question as yet. I don't know if it's.
How about now, Scott?
There we go. That is working.
Great. Really nice talk. I just had a question about slide 17, the last one.
Slide 17, yes.
Yes. So I remember in your example, I forget exactly who group 2 was, but it's interesting to me that group 2 isn't split up in the same way that group 3 is. I mean, I guess I can understand, group 1 is the doctors, they're all the way up front, but I guess my sense is we probably have a lot of observables, and so there probably aren't these like massive differences between the groups such that like everyone in one group is higher than the max in the other one. So I wonder if that would just devolve into basically a priority or a market-based thing, or at least something that is more, that is less stark by group, I guess.
Great.
Thanks,
okay,
Scott.
so first of all, there's linearities in the model that make this sort of like very stark prediction that you actually want the groups sort of like completely separated, group 1, 2, 3, and so forth. That isn't like, we don't think of that as being sort of super realistic. There would actually be concavities that would mean that if you have, a bunch of frontline health workers and a bunch of really high risk individuals, you probably want to be like, moving through both groups simultaneously rather than picking which one has the marginal difference to go first. So first of all, let me just like point to that oversimplification in the model. But then this question here, what's with group 2? Why are they prioritized instead of like also on some sort of price-based slant? And in general, you can have multiple price-based slants. The idea here is group 2 is maybe a group where willingness to pay is just not very informative about their actual level of need. So think of this as workers workers in a firm that has some amount of in-person activity that has to happen and some amount of stuff that can be done remotely. So like a grocery store has employees who work on site at the grocery store, and it also has employees who manage inventory and are probably a little bit more able to work from home, and might also be a little bit high, higher income, in such a fashion that you might get inversion, like the willingness to pay because they have more income, they have more ability to pay, or honestly, more ability to take 2 days off to recover from side effects. If you poll the grocery store workers, you might get the ones who are working from home saying that they're actually like higher willingness to pay. But from a welfare perspective, that's the inverse of what you want. And so that's a context where this V function might actually be decreasing in willingness to pay. And that's a circumstance where you end up doing this prioritization again. Does that help?
Are there any questions in the chat? Could you just show us?
Let's see. Doesn't look like there are any, or at least the last chat message is, do we have any questions on Gather?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Daniel. And I think then we can move on and maybe take any questions on the chat offline. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much.